Very much. So, I'm Justin, by the way, and T32 postdoc scholar in the Division of Clinical Immunology and Rheumatology, and working with Dr. Jeffrey Curtis. So today, just wanted to kind of talk about one of the projects that I've been working on, and really just kind of get some feedback on it. And I welcome all of that. So here's some of my acknowledgements. And outline for today, like I said, just kind of go over the thought process of each piece, and then maybe talk about some feedback and some points of future directions and questions. So as a point of background, accessibility of consumer-grade digital technologies, so like Fitbits and Garmin's, essentially just wearables, to measure biometric and activity outcomes has increased dramatically in recent years. And so as that technology becomes more available and more accessible, it's much more likely for research to get done. It's much more easily to be done. Use in clinical and observational studies have grown, and increased interest in using accelerometers as an objective outcome measure for walking capacity has been of increased interest, especially in special populations like those with Parkinson's and or rheumatoid arthritis. And patients with rheumatoid arthritis is where my focus is going to be. And so just brief background on rheumatoid arthritis. It's a chronic disease. It's characterized by inflammatory activity and joint damage. Of course, when it's left untreated, it can kind of wreak havoc, so causing disability and pain and limitations of function and other things that are very relevant to the patient. Typically, RA patients are seen in clinic every 3 to 6 months, sometimes less often than that. And these clinical assessments at each visit, the clinical assessments at each visit, they're very necessary, but oftentimes they're not sufficient to capture the disease activity that happens in between the visits. So sometimes patients will have flares and or acute episodes, and then 3-6 months down the line, they forget about how much pain it was or how it was, and they kind of have a recall bias about how bad it was. So the point is that perhaps there can be an extension of the point of care. So to better understand this disease activity, severity, it's essential to collect patient-reported outcomes, PROs. And I think most in here should be familiar with the patient-reported outcomes. It's directly reported from the patient, and examples being health-related quality of life, or fatigue, or sleep, or just limits of both mobility. And they directly reflect patients' feelings and functions. It's kind of a point to facilitate a shared decision-making between the physician and the patient, so it's more of a discussion as opposed to a one-way street for treatment options. In general, few published studies have been exploring digital tracking of activity and PROs in rheumatoid arthritis and rheumatoid arthritis population. There's about 2-ish large-scale studies that are kind of going on right now. They were looking at giving patients Fitbits, and then also looking at PROs and seeing how those kind of can track a patient's disease journey. So the current study that I would like to have feedback on is an exploratory study. It's in a larger RA population. It's incorporating digital measures from a Fitbit Versa, so a smartwatch, and electronic PROs. So to begin to assess the value of passively collected digital measures as proxies for disease severity reflected in PRO measures. So the question is it feasible? Is it doable? Is it are we able to derive some sort of value from it? So for this study in particular, the primary objective was to evaluate the agreement between digital measures of activity. So typically with Fitbits and Garmin's and wearables, you're going to get some sort of measure of activity, whether that's steps or acceleration or levels of physical activity, heart rate, if it has a heart rate monitor on it as well, and sleep. And so we're looking at the agreement between those digitally captured measures and electronic PROs for pain and fatigue and physical function in patients who have rheumatoid arthritis, and doing this over a 3-month period, and actually it's going to be over a 6-month period when all things said and done. Secondary objectives would be to examine the measurement of variables of variability of the variables derived from the digital measures. So how much noise is kind of in there, and determine the predictors of adherence with technology. So one of the big barriers that people have been running into is high attrition rates with these types of studies. So people are very excited to do them, and then you can't really keep them engaged for 12 weeks solid. So there's a big question that's being asked of us, I suppose, researchers, to figure out how we can kind of incorporate engagement and kind of getting them into it. So predictors of adherence with the technology, whether that's the wearables and/or an app, and the smartwatch. And then determine which digital measures are associated with components of RA flaring or RA disease activity. So the methods, so participants will be recruited from ARTHRITISPOWER. The ARTHRITISPOWER is a PCORI-funded patient-powered research network. There's a lot of alphabet soup going on here. So PCORI is patient-centered outcomes research initiatives, and it has funded 20 patient-powered research networks across the country, and ARTHRITISPOWER is one of them. And they are, members of ARTHRITISPOWER are a subset of an arthritis patient community, and they are called creaky joints. So a subset of creaky joints is ARTHRITISPOWER, and they are members or participants or people who have decided that they want to be a part of the research process. So the study eligibility, this is going to be a study that is a subset of the ARTHRITISPOWER patient registry. So already highly motivated, already involved, already have downloaded the app that is the ARTHRITISPOWER app and connected it and everything. So much more of an exploratory type study with a highly engaged user base. So the study eligibility criteria is very broad, with over 19 years old, having RA, it's self-reported RA, and then taking an RA-specific medication, having a rheumatologist, owning a smartphone, being a member of the ARTHRITISPOWER community. So here's just an example of a web page to join ARTHRITISPOWER, and you can see that they have there's an ARTHRITISPOWER app as well, where participants can download that and join in on fun. But so just for all intents and purposes, ARTHRITISPOWER is the patient research registry, and the patient community, the larger patient community, is the creaky joints patient community. So features of the ARTHRITISPOWER app is a smartphone app, and patients, once they sign up, so when they sign up for this ARTHRITISPOWER patient research network, they are there's a consent that they will be consenting to join the research and to take studies, to be solicited for research studies and join in on taking measures. But they also have the ability to track themselves, their condition, their disease state. They can share their PROs that they can take, and they can select with their physician or their friends or whomever it may be, and also have the opportunity for other research opportunities. So not in this study, but in the ARTHRITISPOWER patient community in general, they have an option to select or customize what PROs that they have that they want to track. So whether that is coming down from or across from a shared decision making with a physician or rheumatologist, or if they're just interested in learning more about their fatigue or their sleep or whatever, they have the option to choose these types of patient-reported outcomes. For data collection, so it will be within ARTHRITISPOWER patient community, and once the participants have signed up and they've signed the informed consent, then it is kind of like the beginning of a baseline survey. Kind of gives some demographics and just some baseline questions from the members as they sign up, and then they're enrolled into the network. Symptom reporting includes a set of validated PRO measures, as you can see here, and for the most part it's tied in with the NIH Promise system, and that is a computer adapted, the CAT version, so it's not the long 30 item piece. It's a quick way to assess whether or not somebody is needing to take the whole assessment on. So now, going back into the study, the data collection for health assessment PROs, the way that the design will be set up, and that'll be on the next page, but participants will be solicited for a research opportunity, and then there's going to be kind of a lead-in period. Let me jump forward really quick. So there's going to be a little bit of a lead-in period. So it's one of the carrots is, if you want to do this study, you'll get a free Fitbit, a free Versa. But we don't want to just send free Versas out to anybody who wants one. So we want to make sure that everything's compatible with doing research and also not having high attrition rates. And so there is a 2-week kind of lead-in period where participants will need to take daily one-item measures of PROs, so a one-item fatigue score and a one-item flare score, and once weekly, 7-item PROs. So the 7 items probably takes about 10 minutes for the participant to take, but the daily PROs are about, I mean, it's just one question. If they take 10, 10 out of 14 days, then unlock, bless you, the Fitbit Versa, and we'll send them a Fitbit Versa and get them ready for the main part of the study. And the main part of the study will be 84 days. And at this point, they will be required, or we ask them to take the daily PROs and then the weekly longer PROs sessions as well. And there are some financial incentives that are sprinkled in there at two points. It's essentially a baseline study and a baseline survey and a follow-up survey, and with small financial incentives there. Once the participant has finished all 84 days, there is a lead-out period. And the purpose of the lead-out period is to kind of take away all the nudges that we have incorporated into this first 90 days, and to see how fast things drop off, or if they do. And incorporated, there are some incorporated nudges for if participants haven't synced their watch, their smartwatch, or if they haven't been uploading their data, or if they are taking their PRO measures. There are some mechanisms to kind of trigger some nudges for them to get back on track. So there will be the active, if you will, PROs that will be collected, and daily PROs, weekly PROs, and the Godin exercise frequency and intensity scale or score. And then passively collected digital measures, as I mentioned earlier, it's from the Fitbit Versa, the activity derived, the heart rate derived, and or the sleep derived measures. So the current status and next steps. So currently, this is under IRB review, so we're kind of waiting, and once the IRB review has has occurred, and then we can kind of hit the ground running with deploying this intervention, which is going to be exciting because we're going to essentially solicit people to join the study, and then once they have done the 2-week lead-in period, then we are going to remotely enroll them into downloading this Fitbit app on their phone, and then just hoping that we have designed it appropriately, that it's intuitive enough for them to just set it and forget it. And it's a little bit of a process. When you set up the Fitbit Versa, it's about an hour process. You got to make sure that you have good Wi-Fi, and that you're patient enough to follow some of the steps that we've laid out. So we tried to trim it down as much as possible, but that's definitely going to be a barrier no matter what. For future directions, so currently there's I have a systematic review that is in progress at this moment, and so the short of it is assessing the validity of consumer-based activity trackers, so wearables, Fitbit and Garmin and Apple Watch, as compared to a gold standard. And a gold standard either being direct observation and or research grade monitor. And that is in a population of chronic musculoskeletal conditions. And what will come out of, and then the other thing that's kind of in the pipeline right now is also a parallel validity study with this current study. So the idea is to assess the validity of a consumer-based wearable or Fitbit Versa and see if it does as well in the lab and in the wild. So when we send them home, and then eventually, or hopefully, if it is as good, then some inferences can be made for larger scaled-up studies that in this certain patient population, we have some degree of certainty, maybe, that this is actually doing what it says that it's doing. But the big thing is that most of these devices are worn on the wrist, and for accuracy's sake, the best is like at the hip or even on the lower part of the back, and that's just not cool to wear it on your hip or your back, so it's kind of a hard sell with that. So we'll see how that goes. But for the validation study, the objectives are to determine the accuracy and the precision of this research grade and the Fitbit accelerometer. And so that's measuring steps taken during various speeds of prolonged overground ambulation. So steps recorded versus steps measured in patients with RA. So the first one is to determine the accuracy and precision, and the next one is going to be to develop some sort of activity track cut points to say that this person is in moderate, vigorous types of activity based on their condition, disease stage, and or ambulation status. So, and then send them out into the wild, into the real world, for 2 weeks. So they come to the lab. It's about a 90-minute session, and we're going to do energy expenditure and basal metabolic rate, and get that with about 3 different types of trackers and sensors, and then send them home with a research grade tracker, the Actigraph, a Fitbit Versa, and also a Fitbit Zip that does go on the hip. So they'll wear this for 2 weeks, and then they'll come back and trying to tie this into a larger study that once you have finished this, hey, we've got this other study that's going on, and you can keep your Fitbit Versa if you'd like to be in this larger study. So that's kind of the idea with that as well. And very brief, that is that. Questions and feedback.
Thank you. I think that was a great presentation. It sounds like a neat study, and leveraging some of the existing infrastructure makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, so you talked about having very brief daily, I think, PROs, and then sort of the more expanded at fixed time. How are you going to push those out, and are you going to vary the times? And I'm wondering how much that's sort of approaching an ecologic momentary assessment kind of approach, and if maybe you would want to do it multiple times during the day.
That was an initial pitch when we were designing the protocol.
Yeah.
And the short of it is that it was too big of an ask at this moment to try and plan out the EMA type of the ecological momentary assessment.
Big of an ask for participants or the programmers?
The programmers.
Okay.
Yeah, at this moment. But that is definitely being considered for a follow-up study. Or there's another study similar to this where we have a similar 3-month, a 6-month total design where we kind of take everything away, and perhaps we integrate the ecological momentary assessment at that end to see if it has anything to do with attrition rates and whatnot. So, and there are also some pieces of social incentives. So my background is more in health behavior interventions, behavioral economics, and my dissertation was more related to medication adherence. And so it bodes well into health behavior, but you can get a little excited with throwing a lot of incentives at people and trying to increase the attrition rate, but I mean, which one is actually doing it? So we've got to be kind of methodical with when and where we do it.
So a couple things. I thought that was great. I really like the fact that you're using pedometers and thinking about hip versus wrist, because I've done a lot of this work, and we're finding differences in my mentees in pulmonary hypertension. I have another one working in scleroderma. The pulmonary hypertension person is actually using a 6-minute walk because that's been used so much in pulmonary hypertension medication trials. I don't know RIM or cardiologist, so I think that that enhances, when you go to publish, who's really looking at these things. And I don't know if RA is using 6-minute. I also love the fact that you're looking at the comparison of the wrist versus the hip, because there are differences. And having sit in study sections, there will be people who will be looking at your references and saying you're referencing, someone who used a tracker on the wrist, but you're talking about validity on the hip. So it sounds like you're doing great. Two other quick comments. One is the run-in. It makes a lot of sense. I use that to see if people are actually going to do what I want. But it also will help you with reactivity, because oftentimes when people get something, they're going to walk more. And so is that really reflective of who they really are and their in the wild patterns?
Right.
Probably not. So that's a great way of looking at the people who continue on to see if they were up here or were they there.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
one of the inclusion requirements is wear it all the time,
Right.
shower with it, sleep with it, and only take it off to charge. So we're asking if you feel like you can do this, like that's all the boxes that need to be checked. Because we want to set that precedent of please wear it all the time. And then hopefully eventually they do, don't forget about it.
Yeah, we've had mixed. I think it depends on the population.
Yeah.
We've been doing this with people before and after different vascular surgeries, and we find sometimes people will say, well, I'm not really doing anything, so I didn't put it on, despite all the instructions. Lastly, just based on what Andrea was saying, as you move along and you're thinking about the levels of prompting and responses, and I see this more in intervention trials, but thinking about some of the strategic ways of being able to understand when people want prompts, micro-randomization trials are something that would be really good for that.
Micro-randomization?
Yep. You need a statistician.
I think we have a little bit of time. I wonder if you might just share with us about ecological momentary assessment. I imagine there's some in the room that aren't familiar with that methodology and might just be interested in what you know. And if you don't know a lot about it, we can look to others that have done
Just a little bit. Correct me if I'm wrong,
I know,
but
enough to
essentially
be
it's
dangerous.
a instead of giving somebody a reminder every day at 9 or having them pick the same hour, basically you would say, okay, from 9 to 5 or 9 to 10 p.m., I'm just going to ping you one time or two times randomly at that time. It doesn't matter. Like, you're not going to know when, I'm not going to know when, but you're going to get it, and then we're going to see how you react to it. And so we've tried to put in some questions on the front end. What are your sleep patterns? What's your occupation? How are you a shift worker? Do you sleep weird hours? Things that as with some previous studies, you do a look back in the data and you go, I don't know why this is here. They've got heart rate data, but they've got no step data, or they've got step data, they've got heart rate data. What are they doing? So maybe shedding some light on what they do and what their occupation is. If they're on their feet all day, or if they're like a UPS person or something.
And I've seen it used in terms of recall, in terms of when you might get global recall, but you want to say things like stigma or experiences of that nature, where you want to kind of get not just over the last 30 days or 90 days, but like right now, in the last whatever amount of time, did you experience X, Y, or Z, and trying to kind of get more of that lived experience.
Yeah, and then
to the
hopefully,
extent that you can marry it with biologic data, that's, I think,
Yes.
the key. So you made a comment at the beginning of your talk about how some of these measures of pain or function that are subject to recall bias. And so the context that we're thinking about using it in is for comorbid depression and diabetes. So we have people who do an assessment at 6 months or 12 months, but that doesn't really tell you about in the moment mood fluctuation and how that impacts blood sugar. And so the study that we're thinking about would provide that ping randomly 7 times a day while wearing continuous glucose monitors, so that you could actually sort of match the momentary assessments to blood sugar. But it sounds like an overwhelming amount of data.
yeah.
So it's like good and bad, right?
Where's the
It's like,
alert
oh crap.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of stuff, yeah.
But it's illuminating. It could be very illuminating.
Yeah.
So it's exciting, but I feel like it's sort of a cutting edge type of technology, I think. So
Yeah.
I think even more in the psychology and sociology world than the biomedical, but it seems like there's been some crossover and kind of opportunity.
A lot of opportunity.
So, having just spent this past month trying to do a budget where I'm still working with programs in Michigan, who are you working with down here?
Jeffrey Curtis.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right, okay.
Is that, and with Global Healthy Living Foundation, and of course PeakOrdinet, and the ARTHRITISPOWER, Patient Powered Research Network, and this study in particular is in conjunction with Eli Lilly Company.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
I have 2 more questions. First of all, are you working with an internal programming group or are you using a commercial group?
Internal, but not to UAB, to the Global Healthy Living Foundation. David Curtis, who is the lead programmer for the ARTHRITISPOWER app, we have a very intimate working relationship with him, and it's like, can't call him on the phone and say, hey man, can you program this or whatever, and so many asks are coming along the line that they said, okay, let us get these before us and then we'll work on the EMA type things. But it's kind of in-house, but not UAB in-house.
Right. There are companies that are doing EMA
Okay.
commercially.
Any that pop off your head?
I have one. Yeah, I don't remember the name.
Okay.
I have to go back and look at my email, but it's more expensive.
It's
But
a lot
they're more consumer friendly, and they're driven by their productivity and their delivery. So sometimes that's faster, but you pay for it. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm wondering is, presumably there have been studies that have used this, not maybe exactly the same, but have used the subset of folks who have responded within creaky joints to ARTHRITISPOWER or whatever that subset is. Do you have any information from maybe other studies about how that particular research responsive group looks compared to the rest of the creaky joint microcosm or macrocosm or whatever?
That's a good question, but it's riddled with confounders because these participants who are part of creaky joints say if they want to be part of research, then they actively opt in, plus informed consent, and then plus being engaged in that arm. So I don't know to what extent people who aren't, actually I don't think people who aren't in part of ARTHRITISPOWER, but creaky joints can.
There's no demographics on people who are in creaky joints?
There are demographics, but research-wise, I don't know if there's people not doing research, but I can get back to you.
You could probably look at age, gender, race, some basics,
Okay.
and just say, this is how, because creaky joints is probably already a subset, right, of people, because they've gone online and joined this group. So they're already different.
Right.
But then within that, so you might be able to look at some, I don't know, for arthritis where you go, but for BRFSS or something for diabetes, you could look probably at a more global group and compare it to creaky joints, then compare it just for a rough estimate of, how much your population looks like the rest of the RA population.
Okay.
It might or might not be that different.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So it occurs to me that so you're using these commercial products, right, which are going to change over time.
Mm-hmm.
Have you thought about like how you make sure that things are tracking? Because the Actigraph, people who make that are motivated to keep it at least relatively similar over time. But Fitbit's motivated to make the new
Innovation.
I think the short answer is I'm not sure because all of their formulas for whatever they're using and putting into their latest Fitbit is all proprietary.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of, you're having to go backwards and figure out what is what. And as long as that technology, and I'm presuming here, as long as that technology isn't too far away from something like an Actigraph or an MC10 or something else, then I would imagine that it should track well with the Actigraph. But I think that's the point of the validity study, is to see if the Versa is as good or not as something that's people are paying lots of money for in the lab, and then perhaps redoing it as the new models come out. But it's speeding up faster than research can get proposed, and then
And I think a lot of the time, as you're doing long-term follow-up, a lot of the time is if they change something, then your API doesn't work, and your programmer has to constantly be your study coordinator always has to be looking at You know, is there any glitches? Who's having problems? Is it just one participant? Is it, 20 participants?
Right.
And then you got to have a very motivated programmer who you can call up, go, there's a problem, and because it's constant fixing, constant. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on that. Do you have a relationship directly with Fitbit so that you'll be getting the data download from them?
So we're using a company called Fitabase, and Fitabase is the research side. I mean, they're not technically affiliated with Fitbit, but they have an API that allows you to get more granular data from the Fitbit devices, and so it's I don't really have a base for if this is expensive or not, but it's essentially like $10 per user per month to have that data, pushed to your device or your phone or whatever. And so we have a lot of questions with like, what's the lag time and how is that going to work? And then how long or how granular will something stay if somebody doesn't sync their data if they're gone for a week? Are we now getting day level data as opposed to minute or hour level data? It just is not as good. But Fitabase is when we spoke with Fitbit, they kind of deferred us to them, and I think they're the research wing that is dealing with a lot of studies that are going on.
Yeah, and companies will, if you could do a commercial company, we interchange for this rehabilitation working with a company called Twizzle, and they kind of help interface with the data. For my R01, I actually have this programmer who just helps with all of that because we pull the data into a disease-specific website. So I think there's a couple different ways to go, but a lot of people are using Fitabase, and I haven't heard.
Twizzle's another one?
Well, Twizzle's it was a while. We wrote it originally in R1, and then when I moved here, I'm trying to do an R34, so they're too expensive, but we were using them specifically, kind of like what you're doing with, certain kind of components for an intervention, and then sending them out messages. We weren't doing, we were doing promise, but at set time points, not like what you're doing.
Yeah, so we're also trying to, as the iOSs and stuff kind of upgrade with the lock screen notifications, and there's a delicate balance with how often you want to bug them, if you will.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things, which they should be by default off, but it's frustrating when you have to take that additional step to make sure that the person has notifications for our app or whatever turned on. So it's just
yeah, a lot of little moving parts.
Just a little comment kind of from the personal experience. So, using insulin pump for some time now. So I know Medtronic, for example, has, excellent software when you can upload your data, and it's actually all on the website, and you can see the trends. So I wonder if you ever looked into this commercial, maybe they even published papers on that as well, from commercial companies like Medtronic, who use different health devices, like insulin pumps, for example. So because it's a tracing of the data almost simultaneously as well. And then in terms of full, assessment of the, patients or participants' characteristics back in time. So I remember working during my PhD with one of the professors who actually was also doing the behavioral economics research. So we used the time-back follow-up instrument. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Time-back follow-up. Mm-hmm. So it's linked participants' experiences with some, weekdays and also with some stuff, behind. And that way they remember. So it's, for example, if you're looking on the substance abuse or alcohol drinking, so this is, helps to remember how much they actually, how many drinks they had.
okay. I'll check it out. Thanks. Yes.
My comment is just that this is really cool. And to that point, Mugs, can we have a methodology session where people talk about how to go about doing ad-based research? Because, it seems like a very, useful.
Yeah.
I have no idea how to start it, especially with the issues of, in-house programmers, the funding to get a commercial programmer.
Sure.
I think it would be really useful.
Okay.
It's a totally different language too when you say,
Yeah.
okay, in my mind this is what I want
There's
you
so
to do,
many
and they
moving
go,
parts.
wait a second, you need to be very explicit with, and then I'm
Yeah.
like, this is
You
what
seriously need an interpreter.
oh yeah.
There has to be an interpreter because it does not go from what you would normally say in a sentence
Uh-huh.
into whatever
Right.
it is
And
in
if you're-
programmer language.
If you're doing like iterative work with patients, you know, it's almost like you're gonna have, you know, you or someone who, like you, who speaks, you know, behavioral research, a human-computer interaction. There's actually people with PhDs, and it's nice to be good friends with them. And then the programmer, and then the patients is really helpful. It's just, they really do, the human-computer interaction guys are great, great, great people to know, because they can take, you know, the biostat person who does microrandomization with their little posse of programmers, and they interpret what's happening. So it's, I like this space because it's so multi-dimensional, but I also walk away going, I think I know a thimbleful. And it's like,
I just know like a little bit of what I thought.
but it's to me, this is a really cool area, because not only can you do interventions to improve health, but, you know, patients, I'm not saying they're always engaged in everything, but, you know, I think that we're making things better by having patients have data at the point where they are. And it's going to make us really be able to see far beyond our clinic little offices. So.
Where do you find human-computer interaction people?
I
Are they in
I
computer
found
engineering?
one
Are
who
they in
found
the
me.
computer world?
Yeah, sometimes. No, so this is my limited, and they have the most wacky abstracts. It's incredible. But I started just calling people in Michigan, and then somebody was recruited who I never even knew you could get a PhD. And I landed on his R01 and just went to every single lab meeting I could. And that's why I wanted to know who you worked with. And then just started to try to get to know. I have not ventured into I'm going to go to some of your meetings, but Society of Behavioral Medicine I really like, because they had people from HIS and some of their other meetings come there. So they're really trying to make collaborations. It was the BitSig who really worked on getting people there, and you know, that's one reason I came, because the human-computer guy that I work with a lot loves that meeting, and then Carolyn Richardson loves that meeting, and
we should think internally. I mean, I think maybe a panel kind of thing would be good.
Right.
Lisa, it sounds like you're going to be on the panel.
nimble full of knowledge.
Maybe we could see if Jeff's done a lot of work.
Jeff
you know,
would be perfect.
James
Well,
Lilly
we could
is
get
a bridge person.
So I was
If we could get a
Let's
perfect.
And that's what I'm thinking about. And maybe we could reach out to, I don't know if there's anyone in engineering here, a computer engineer.
the Grand Challenge Planning Day, retreat day, and at my table. And so I was at the health system delivery table. And there were a bunch of people from computer engineering. And we've had some folks come and give talks so for example, at our diabetes translational work group meeting, we had some folks come who've partnered, like Paula Chandler-Laney had partnered with someone who was trying to create pattern recognition for continuous glucose monitoring data. And so I know there are people in computer engineering who are health focused.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a
I
guy
don't know
doing
who
that
they
with
are.
oncology medications. Gabrielle
to find
something,
out
when I went
what-
to an epi breakfast, she was there, so I went to talk with him. Can't remember his name.
So we'll do some homework, and maybe a
Yeah.
mix of kind of end users. Willig is kind of a translator because he's in the middle, and then someone that speaks the computer language, but hopefully can also speak the English language. I mean, in terms of like sometimes people talk in math and code, so they can help us understand the programming part of it.
If we could get some visiting people, Susan Murphy is just amazing person in terms of this world. She's a biostatistician. She won a MacArthur Genius for microrandomization and really knows the outside community. She moved from Michigan to Harvard, but she would be phenomenal to get to, you know, speak. And then, yeah, there's definitely people who could, I mean, Carolyn could come down and kind of talk about the intersection between medicine
And then we'd also bring this to the core and the CCT. Sometimes we've done these like, you know, annual workshop. One was a learning health system. One was about adherence. I mean, if there's sufficient interest, this could be a nice topic that would be a nice venue to bring in outside experts, you know, and so I think that we could start locally. and then see about possibly if there's sufficient interest, is there opportunity to do it even more broadly and bring in some outside experts. But internally, I think we can do.
That's
You
how
said
we
yes, you can do it.
I'd like to know more people here.
Can I ask you one more quick question? So in terms of eligibility, are you going to be looking at whether individuals already have a tracking device and specifically already have a Fitbit that they use?
So there is a caveat that if you do have a Fitbit already, you need to basically sign out of your account. So we set up the instructions that once you have received your Fitbit Versa, the first thing you need to do is that we've kind of allowed us a little bit more control on how we have them set up the account. So we go ahead and create them an account through Fitabase, and we already create them a dummy email account. And so with the dummy email account, we just say, this is your username, this is your password, go to your Fitbit, you're going to log out of your Fitbit account if you currently have it. No. And if you don't, then that's fine, but if you do, log out of it. You could, I don't want to entertain this, but you could have your dashboard on your desktop separate and upload your data, and then wear them on both arms, I suppose, because there's a lot of joy in getting your badges and having your competitions and stuff. And if you're out for 6 months and it's not connected to your account, then that could be a point where they don't want to do it. But we strongly encourage you not to have your primary Fitbit account on your phone. We need you to log out. Use the one that we're going to give you, and then so.
Interesting, because from a behavioral perspective, those folks could be ones who are already primed to doing and engaging in this kind of work. And then you touched on the other technology issue when you've got two devices. Sometimes that creates challenges.
Oh yeah.
So,
Okay.
This is fascinating, though. Great presentation.
Thank you. And an act of change for our program.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate all your comments.
I'm a pharmacist as well, so I was just wondering about the PhD route too.
It was in Health Outcomes Research and Policy was the department I was in. The technical title was Pharmaceutical Sciences.
Okay.
And I had a focus in behavioral economics.
I'm Julia, so thank you so much for giving the opportunity to present my ideas and my thoughts. So today I'm going to talk about the preventing heart failure via readmissions. So a little bit about myself. I'm a Russian-trained physician who came here as a full-time scholar about 10 years ago to do a PhD in health behavior. I finished and I did a postdoc with preventive medicine Dr. Monica Salford, working with regards data, and then I transitioned into the internal medicine residency on the IBM research pathway. That I finished my 2 clinical years at this point, and I'm on my fellowship as a general fellow. So I'd like to start with the cases, and for the sake of time, for some of my slides, I'm going to go very fast. So this is the cases that I actually personally take care of as a resident in the UAB coronary care unit. So this is a 23-year-old African-American homeless woman with a history of peripartum cardiomyopathy. So this is a type of cardiomyopathy or heart failure, I would say, that occurred during or post delivery of the baby. That cardiomyopathy happened to her when she was age 13. She presented as a transfer to ABCC with symptoms of the volume of the liver. She's also a conversion sex worker. She was here on the mission. She actually lives in Atlanta with some of her relatives. She was seen by the cardiologist in Atlanta, but never was really had a proper follow-up. She was lost to follow-up for many years, and she did not ever prescribe medications. Just to kind of go a little bit quicker from this case, so transferred to UAB, she was started on medication called Milanon. This is one of the inotropes that help with the pumping function of the heart. So we treated her relatively successfully, and we achieved so-called overwhelming state when she didn't have any symptoms or signs of the volume overload anymore. But she was also diagnosed with depression. She was also diagnosed with atrial flutter. Upon discharge, so there was really no place for her to go. So we tried to discharge her to a shelter. She didn't want to go. So she wanted to go to some relatives in Chicago. We got her a bus ticket. We did make arrangements for her follow-up in Chicago with the primary care there and with the cardiology as well for the low-income patients. And so the main question from this case, and why I'm presenting that, so it was a pretty profound case in terms of impact on this patient, on me personally. And at this point, so if we're thinking about readmission, so what is the risk of this particular patient will be readmitted? And this is something like, a line that I would like for everybody to think through when I'm going to go and present some data from the research. So the second case is just only to illustrate how frequent the readmissions are. So this is a 56-year-old African-American woman, pretty extensive past medical history. I'm not going to go much about this, but she also presents with the symptoms of the heart failure exacerbation and volume overloaded. On interview, we find out that she actually was unable to get her diuretic medications because of the lack of money. And after a month, she finally got it, but she already developed these symptoms of the volume overloaded that requires admissions. And this is her previous admission dates, just only in the last year. So you can see it's pretty frequent. Interestingly enough, each time at discharge, she was actually followed in the heart failure clinic. She was compliant with her fluid restriction and salt restriction as well. So I'm going to talk about heart failure admissions in terms of what we know from the population-based studies and randomized controlled clinical trials. I would like to specifically look on the patient perspective, what they think about why they're getting admissions. Then I'm going to talk about summary and gap in knowledge, my planned study focus program, objective and studies, proposing using the regards data, and then preparation for my K awards that I would like to specifically focus on the mixed marketing research and patient study approach, my timeline, and my mentorship panel. So what we know from data is that heart failure admissions are very prevalent. And what is the readmission? How we understand that? So it's when the person has index hospitalization for heart failure. So what is the chance this person is going to be readmitted to the hospital within 1 year and within 30 days? So this is a very standard timeline that we're looking at. So why do you think the readmissions are bad? So, first of all, it's one of the hospital metrics that they're working at, and it means that maybe the original treatment for the index hospitalizations will lack in some features. Also, there's another part of research that's showing that readmissions actually associated with the poor quality of life of the patients as well. So, another very important point that I actually discovered myself, that especially when you look on the 30-day readmission statistics, that most of the readmissions for these patients is actually not for heart failure. So in this respect, the heart failure readmissions maybe is a misnomer. It's a readmissions for patients with heart failure. So the study showing from 17 to 35% only admitted for the heart failure exacerbations. The rest is actually admitted for other causes. And this is more interesting when we look on the two main entities of heart failure with the preserved EF and heart failure with the reduced EF. So for patients with the heart failure for the preserved EF, so this is even more applicable than for those who have reduced EF. So patients who have reduced EF usually, so there is a 50% split on the 30-day admissions between the heart failure causes per se and not heart failure causes.
Can I ask you a quick clarifying question? Is that
Sure.
okay? In terms of that 17 to 35%, does that include any side effects from treatment? You mean, so if someone was to, not necessarily come back in with heart failure, but as a result of their treatment for heart failure, have some sort of a complication requiring readmission, be it like their renal failure because they were overly diuretic?
So they usually go into, and that's what this slide showed. They usually go into non-CVD causes. So, and this is very, as you just pointed out, overdiuresis or renal disease on top of the as a comorbidity is one of the first actually causes of the non-CVD. So, and it's also sepsis, pneumonia, COPD. This is another entity. There's actually a lot of poor admissions going together with the COPD exacerbation and heart failure exacerbations, and also fluid electrolyte disbalance. as well. So it's actually not CVD. When we look on this period from day 1 from the index hospitalization discharge to day 30, so the 73%, around, I would say, 2/3 of patients, so they will be readmitted after the first week. So during the first week, it seems like they're doing fine, and this is very important to think about because when I'm going to talk about the intervention strategies, so a lot of intervention strategies actually focusing on the first 74 days, which is 3 days from discharge. However, it seems like the whole 30-day period is a very critical period for patients, and maybe even towards the 30-day period. It's very important to think about when we target. So what we know from studies that which are the factors predicting readmissions? So, first of all, the characteristics of the index hospitalizations, meaning that overall arching theme in the research is that if patients have bad heart failure and the hospitalization has a lot of things, length of stay is longer, if they're on inotropes, and if they're, other biological, physiological, measures, like, for example, BUN or creatinine, or there's other studies that's showing sodium. So if there is any kind of biochemical, baseline features of the heart failure, exacerbation, acute exacerbation that are really critical and bad, so they're probably more likely to be admitted because the disease is really bad. So the same goes with the more than 1 ER visits prior to hospitalization. Interestingly enough, discharge to skilled nursing facility or home health associated with admissions as well. Transfers from the another hospital, like my first case was an emergent admission. So this is all the features of the index hospitalization. So psychosocial factors seems to be extremely important. So there is a host of papers showing that depression and lack of social support essentially. Income, retired status, insurance status as well, and cognitive barriers. So inability to understand discharge instructions, because heart failure is one of the most complex diseases from my standpoint for patients to follow instructions. Non-English speaker. So factors that we actually have unclear or mixed data include, interestingly enough, demographics, comorbidities, and ejection fraction. So a few studies looked on the ejection fraction, and some of them said that participants actually with their, interesting enough, reduced ejection fraction have more rates of readmissions than reduced ejection fraction. But this is, again, there's some mixed data on this. And then, interestingly enough, again, so factors actually don't predict readmissions in the randomized clinical trials. This is a pragmatic study looking on heart failure adherence. Retention trial was looking also on the self-management interventions. So the adherence to low-salt diets did not predict. Physicians' adherence to heart failure guidelines, that was the most controversial that I ever read. Patient adherence to medical therapy does not predict either. And self-management interventions, no difference in their admission rate. So this is very kind of controversial points from this study, but this is also a food for thought. So just very briefly summarize, so what do we have right now in the field? So what are the strategies to reduce heart failure admission? So disease management programs, physician care programs, and hospital-based quality initiatives. So what are some of the results of this? So in general, the guideline-based medication therapy, so the strongest evidence for the medications called angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitors and angiotensin receptor blockers. So this is the strongest evidence for them, as opposed to some other medications we have. So hospital quality improvement interventions, unfortunately, from the reviews, not very effective. So the most interesting data goes into the transition of care intervention. So there's a mixed results on them. So it seems like there's some interventions more effective than others. And transitions of care interventions, so those interventions are acute upon discharge. They also focus on patients in their homes, and something that is happening with the patients right after discharge at home. That seems where kind of the main money is in terms of understanding why the admission rates are so high. And some of the promising features of this intervention showing is that it's using checklists at discharge in the, for example, CCUs or any other, places in the hospital the patient has been treated. Also, actually, there is a study showing that if patients were treated in this specialized units, for example, CCUs or departments of the hospital that looking specifically on the heart failure treatment. So specialized units are better. Close follow-up and in-person follow-up is more effective than by phone. And by close follow-up, they mean with heart failure in clinic, but also home visits, telehealth interventions, transitional or discharge coaches that usually lay people, peer support coaches, and any programs that enhance social support found to be effective. So if you look on the patient perspective, so there's few studies that kind of pretty much ask people, so why do you think you've been readmitted to the hospital? And so that's what something, themes from the studies that showed that, so mainly it's a distress from the somatic symptoms. For example, shortness of breath. So patients just got, scared. They didn't know what to do other than go to the ER and get readmitted. So the other thing is dealing with the, unavoidable progression of the chronic diseases. And it's not necessarily always heart failure, but it's also pulmonary disease, diabetes, renal disease. A lot of participants of those studies cite inadequate social support and financial. Interestingly enough, again, so most patients actually do report compliance with the medications and the regimen overall, but of course it's self-reported that maybe some limitations are there. And another topic, very interesting, maybe also very controversial for us as clinicians to think about. So they talk about premature discharge and problems with follow-up. When premature discharge, so there is a quote in the study from the patient who is saying, well, I don't think I was ready to be discharged, but I was discharged. And then problems with follow-up. I needed to go to the clinic, but for some reasons, they were canceling appointments or something happened to that. And so there's another nice study was just actually completed this year that it was looking at using mixed methods, using semi-structured interviews in focus group with the patients who were readmitted, and they were looking specifically what are the patient perspective on the challenges of the heart failure management at home. And so they found out, so there's a key process actually here. It's called adherence versus adaptation. So adherence is something what we as physicians want them to do as a behavior. However, a lot of patients feel like it's adaptation to things what we told them to do. And I can give you an example. A patient of mine I was supposed to see yesterday in the clinic, they actually was a loss to follow-up, unfortunately. So he was just treated in the VA for the acute heart failure exacerbations. They told him to stop his Viagra because they started him on the nitrate medications. 2 medications together cannot be prescribed. So which kind of part of this process the patient will gonna go? So is that adherence or that's adaptation? Because maybe Viagra, this is something that he, wanted to have on his list as of medications. And nitrates, maybe he's not necessarily eager to take just because he had to stop Viagra. So that's kind of question that I'm pondering myself, as a physician, but it's also very important to think about these perspectives. And so they identified 2 cognitive processes among these patients. So one is called the cycle of limit testing, and the other one is called the cycle of despair. So this cycle of limit testing is the patients who not necessarily want to adhere, so they're more in the adaptation phase. So they basically, try to, for example, okay, so if I try, some McDonald's today, what's going to happen to me? And there is a lag of time between the symptoms of volume overload and salt buildup, for example, and their behavior. So if they feel like their behavior, they can go on and just kind of don't necessarily adhere to the regimen, and nothing happens. So that's what this cycle of limit testing happens, and finally they develop the symptoms that causes some emotional distress, and ultimately they think about there's fear consequences, and they think about hospital readmissions as a rational choice. So versus people who actually adhere and they follow the directions, but despite everything, they still have symptoms of heart failure, and they're in this cycle of despair because they don't understand what else I can do, but I'm still having issues with this. And I thought this is one of the most wonderful conceptual framework I've ever presented so far. So just to summarize what I said, so readmissions are very common. So majority are not for heart failure readmissions if you look on the 30-day readmission rates. So there's mixed evidence on the factors that associate with the heart failure readmissions. how depression and other social factors represent the highest risk. So, and the current strategy is focusing only on heart failure itself. So it seems like leaving many other factors behind, including patient perspective as well. So there's limited data for the actual patient and caregiver interventions that are in the field. So therefore, just really briefly, just want to kind of present my, I would say, study program focus, because it actually entails a couple of studies, or even 3 studies at this point. So the study 1 will look at closure follow-up. Study 2 will look on the depressive symptoms. And my keyword application that I'm kind of still thinking through about would like to employ the patient caregiver-centered approach. So very briefly about study 1. So the main idea, the main question is, so if we put in the perspective that patients are needed mostly for other causes than heart failure, so is the follow-up with primary care provider will be associated with the low risk of 30-day and 6-month readmission compared to follow-up with the heart failure clinic only, and with no follow-up at all among regards Medicare participants with index hospitalizations with heart failure. So the hypothesis behind that, if they have follow-up with primary care can actually address other issues that heart failure, maybe a little bit more comprehensive way, and that probably would be specifically important for participants with a preserved ejection fraction. So in terms of the status, I'm just writing the paper proposal at this point. So this is just only discussed with some of my mentors. So study 2 is looking on depressive symptoms and actually incident heart failure hospitalizations among adults in the regard study. So there are 2 hypotheses here. So the one is that depressive symptoms will be associated with the increased risk of incident heart failure hospitalizations. And the second one, there will be different association depending on the overall cardiovascular risks, meaning that those people who have overall high cardiovascular risk, as defined by the atherosclerotic study CVD risk score from the full equation cohort studies, that those with higher risk actually will have more pronounced association with depressive symptoms. Those without risk may not have those associations. And so there's a lot of mechanisms actually described in the literature in terms of the depressive symptoms and the heart failure. So first of all, depressive symptoms actually showed as an independent predictive factors in other studies of the other cardiovascular disease. So for example, acute myocardial infarction. We actually have those studies in the regards published already, but not so much in the field of heart failure. And the different mechanisms employed, so one of the direct mechanisms, for example, influence on the inflammatory biomarkers, or indirect, being a proxy of general well-being overall. So, and the manuscript status for this that is proposed and has been written, actually approved by the regards executive committee at this point. Nicely, a few just weeks ago, Matt Baffert has described the regards study. So I'm just going to briefly touch upon that. It's a national prospective cohort of older adults in the United States, sampled from all continental states. More than 30,000 participants at baseline, with oversampling in the stroke belt and African Americans. So the baseline data collection was occurring on the phone interviews and in-home study visit. We also actually just finished the second in-home study visit that the baseline data has been repeatedly collected on the second in-home visit as well. And these participants also have follow-up with every 6 months. So the important part of the regards study, so there is subset of the study called regards Medicare linkage data. So we took 80% of participants with who were 65 years and older and linked those participants with the Medicare data. So why it's important? Because now we can have the information on the hospitalization, but also we have a host of the behavioral factors, comorbidities, demographics, health behaviors that not every study has. And few studies have shown that those subset of the participants are actually representative of the cohort and also representative of the medic. So, kind of going back to that conceptual framework that I just presented from the study. So where these studies will go. So study 1, again, those studies that are looking on the primary care follow-up will address comorbidities, will address the distress and fear of the consequences of their behavior, because if primary care see this patient pretty quick, and if somebody has trouble and they have questions, for example, about discharge instructions they didn't realize or they didn't understand, so they can't actually discuss that with the primary care. Or there's a lot of things, for example, medications prescribed for heart failure, but maybe there's some other comorbidities that we're not taking into account. Usually we do, but there could be a possibility of that. So again, primary care can look on the participants as a whole or patients as a whole, as opposed to just only heart failure. And then study 2, again, this is the depressive symptom study. So it will be looking at the, depression can be a comorbidity as well. But it can be also looking on the emotional response to symptoms and to the behaviors that the patient experiencing. And this, the key word application, the mixed method study that I'm doing, will be looking on the emotional response, hopelessness, and also the caregiver input, because I'd like to include the caregivers in my study as well. So the timeline that I proposed is that my first year as a fellow, complete study 1 and study 2, and have it accepted to the publications by July. And the second year, mostly looking and writing up the K-award publication. So the future direction. So let's say if we find that primary care follow-up is a significant predictor of the reduced readmission rate. So maybe this can be also included into discharge checklist in the discharge from patients from the specialized units. So I know we have in CCU, for example, we always schedule for within 1 week follow-up with the heart failure clinic. So we not necessarily always schedule also with the primary care, as far as I remember, as a resident. In study 2, so what if depressive symptoms do predict independently index of heart failure hospitalization? So it can be also addressed as a primary care. When we approach the patient, we can think about that. For example, we have some screenings in place for depressive symptoms in the VA. So we can address that. Also thinking, well, we can actually help these patients, especially with the cardiovascular risk, prevent, from index hospitalization for heart failure as well. And then, so this is the most important where I actually need your comments, is the preparation of my K-award, looking on the mixed method studies I mentioned. And my interest is looking on patient perspective. Given that we know that depressive symptoms and distress symptoms, one of the most powerful predictors of their admissions. So do they really know how to identify that? Do they realize that this is actually true for them? And are they ready for any sort of treatment? And by treatment, I'm not thinking about prescribing antidepressants, but more likely, some sort of, cognitive behavioral approaches or any sort of that, focus on this. And this is maybe we can just have a lot of interactions at this point, So what if we have, who my focus group or what my target group should be? Would that be patients, caregivers, nurses? Should I do subgroup analysis by the ejection fraction? Where's the setting of this? I guess data collection should be. So this is something that I would like actually to discuss even, as I end of this, meeting during this. And this is just my mentorship panel that, some of them are here, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Charrington, and Dr. Leviton. And then some of my mentors also from the Yale Cornell. And I want to thank everybody for that, for the moment when, I, here. So questions, and more actually important for me, your thoughts, especially about this.
I think with the qualitative data, it's going to be interesting what you get, because I wonder if the perception from caregivers, I think at least, and again, I'm fairly new here, but I do think that a lot of times there is this kind of like, let's hook you in with heart failure, you know, kind of querying the inpatient caregivers in terms of the importance of that immediate follow-up with the primary care might be helpful. And then, you know, I think a lot of times the perception is that you know, there's been some slip in the diet and it's kind of snowballed a bit. It can be one thing that we're commonly trying to query. You know, the perception, you know, of what patients think is the reasoning and the factors behind getting into the hospital versus is there continuity and themes or discontinuity with the caregiver's perspective might be helpful to sort of, there's a lot of, you know, gaps between what these groups think that might be helpful. You know, my hypothesis would be everybody would be thinking that depression is an important thing to manage. Whether we caregivers, particularly cardiologists, understand how to do that is not clear to me.
So I think your study with regard to Medicare data is going to be a little tricky on a couple of fronts. So one is that, so I think there have been a couple of studies actually that do show that PCP follow-up in the first week is helpful. And I can't give you a reference offhand, but I'm pretty sure that people have looked at that. The other thing is that you're going to have to be careful about immortal time and think very carefully about how to do that because you know you have to not be right. So if your follow-up is scheduled 4 days after your discharge, and if you're scheduled, and if you go in 3 days after, you know you don't have the opportunity to make that follow-up visit. So there are some statistical techniques that can get at that, but immortal time bias is going to be an issue here. And then the last thing is thinking about you know what is actually in that data, so you don't get information about whether it's a heart failure clinic or not. What you get is the specialty code for the provider. And so, you know, and it's not, there is no specialty code for primary care provider. So thinking about, you know, what does that mean? So do you want, like, you know, there's general internal medicine, there's, you know, gerontology, there's family medicine. So thinking about, you know, how are you going to actually parse that out?
Thinking about setting, I was thinking about probably a lot of heart failure admissions come to general medicine services and don't come to cardiology services, and the distinctions between those services and how important is that. There's probably a lot of variability based upon practice setting too, I imagine. You know what I mean? So what's done at UAB hospital is very different than what's done in other health systems. I'm just trying to think about how much setting matters. In terms of the qualitative data, I guess part of my thinking is where do you see this going in terms of intervention? You know, because in some ways, while the providers in the hospital's thoughts about depression, it might be informative or interesting, but if they're not going to be part of the intervention and the solution, I'm not sure how much it matters. I mean, just trying to think about if depression is important, if it's going to be someone else on the inpatient or outpatient care team or an ancillary person, be it this endogenous support with the caregiver or an exogenous support where you're going to identify some third party. So I was just thinking targeting the qualitative work, having an eye towards, while I think a lot of it could be informative, you know, you might not know, and so it might have to be broad, but like where do you see an intervention going that might get at some of those patient factors of social support and some of those things identified, and making sure that those groups are targeted.
So I guess, you know, if I don't know if I address your question correctly, but my understanding is, so for example, if we feel like that depression has to be addressed is one of the post-discharge follow-up. So I think that the target audience for that study would be primary care physicians.
I'm wondering if there's a bridge to the primary care physician, because I think, you know, that this also becomes part of the question is, even if you have the data and deliver it, so someone added to the schedule within a week on an already full schedule, you know, is the provider going to really take the time to think about depression, to think about, are you taking your diuretic, are you doing your low salt diet, am I adhering, and that study's showing adherence to guidelines, so there's something else that's driving this, right? I mean, it's not, so if I'm there seeing someone, I got 10 patients already, this is number 11, right? I see them within a week because my schedule's packed, so I'm just trying to think about, you know, what is that missing piece? There's been so much work in this, and I think you've convinced me that something is clearly missing at an individual level that,
Right.
you know, and it relates to social support or something in that dimension.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point of like, where do you see, you know, all of the work that you're doing over the years ending up in an intervention trial, then what's that going to look like? The other thing besides a packed schedule for primary care is if people are being readmitted, you know, really soon, like even before they see their primary care, then it's you know, having the primary care address the depression might not work. It's almost like, you know, how do you identify the people who are depressed that need that if you treat it, you're going to have a reduced readmission.
And yeah, one more thing on the visit part that's interesting, and I don't know if you get this in claims because you only get did the visit happen, you don't get did it not happen. And so I've spent my entire career working on missed clinic visits, which is amazing because it's like really simple, but still doing it and still have a job, which is cool. But you know, if some of this work was in the health system, that's another angle to it. So you could not only measure through claims, did a visit happen within a week, but was it scheduled, when was it scheduled, taking into account the mortality bias, and does missing that visit, you know, is a whole other angle, but that would be from more of a learning health system lens than a claims lens.
So a couple of thoughts building off of that discussion. One is, you know, thinking about interventions, it just may back up to the hospitalization, and that's where you could do the depression screening.
Yeah.
And actually that's where you need to initiate whatever it is you're going to do, including the bridge to primary care. I think in terms of thinking about where you want to focus, to Mike's point, if you're looking, so for example, in the REGARD study, you're talking about incident heart failure admission. So those will go probably to general medicine, but those are probably also, you know, have a lower proportion of readmissions. So you could go from that kind of blanket area. They're also probably the ones who are most likely to schedule follow-up with primary care because they're generalists, or maybe heart failure because then they want to kick it out. Versus breaking that cycle of readmissions, which you would probably be more likely to find in the CCU. So, you know, there you're going to have probably a much higher proportion of folks who are just coming in and coming in and coming in,
So
I would think. So
Yeah.
that would be a little bit around sort of picking where you want to focus and what sort of the low-hanging fruit. And then my final comment is just, so in terms of thinking about the setting as well, aligning yourself where, especially if you're going to be reliant potentially upon health system data in wherever you are, aligning yourself with the folks who are interested in this right now. And so I think that CHF, is part of the Medicare shared MSSP, Medicare Shared Savings Program, where we have a big ACO, and that's one of the at UAB, and that's one of the main diagnostic categories. And so they are actively implementing interventions as we speak to reduce readmissions among those folks. And there may be an opportunity for some kind of a natural experiment evaluation within that. Because I know they have contracted, I think, with an entity called Guideway, which is, which I hate to give credence to, but anyway, so they're patient navigators, and they are specifically going to be targeting Medicare folks who fall into these different areas. So I don't know if you could do some kind of evaluation over time. I mean, there's all kinds of, you'd have to get somebody who's really good at thinking about temporal trends and all that kind of stuff, but you might be able to at least get some preliminary data around impact of intervention. I know Reagan's doing an actual study, but the Guideway piece is purely a clinical service. There's no one, to my knowledge, evaluating that from a research standpoint.
That's a great idea. Just a little comment, in terms of the settings differences. So from my experience, maybe Dr. Jackson can correct me if I'm wrong. So CCU admissions, those folks are actually much more sick. So for them, this is something they would probably go into the categories of the, characteristics of the index admissions because they're just sick. They, this is the natural kind of progression of the disease. They get readmitted.
Yeah.
Another thing to think about is, consider pathways other than a K, because you've had a lot of training as an MD, PhD with 2 postdocs. Trying to say I need more training is going to be a hard sell. Just something to put in your potential planning. I mean, it's probably worth writing in K, but I can absolutely see that being a good.
Except that she doesn't have anything in the cardio, or limited
Mixed methods.
papers in CHF or in mixed methods, so I'm afraid she would get dinged if she went in for an R01. There's no way. Well, this is something for a
Yeah, I mean, just
mentorship panel to discuss.
Yeah.
Sounds right.
I get what you mean, but I think we probably need to make a little benefits and risks list.
I think that's a good idea, and maybe even
I
find
agree.
people who are currently sitting on a K, because I can definitely see both points of view. So getting back to the hospital kind of thing, they're definitely, I mean, again, I'm not that experienced here, but I do think there's been a big shift with the growth of hospitalists, that you've got, your kind of first time, fairly low acuity heart failure in the hospital as gen med service. The next step up, maybe a little bit more frequent flyers, more severity in, the general card service. We have 4 services at Michigan, and, I would say 80% of those were the heart failures that sometimes were coming in every month, but maybe every 3 months, maybe a couple times. And then you've got the LVADs end stage on a heart failure specialist team. There's going to be slight variations across the country because people are readjusting, particularly with this, we're going to lose money if people, every hospital has to be thinking about this now. It's a huge dig and pain in getting money taken away from you.
I wonder if folks have looked at social determinants and where you land in the hospital, because I feel like at least, the UAB perspective.
That's very interesting.
The UAB perspective, like the Tinsley service, independent of your degree of severity, at Hufflepuff or Gryffindor, I'm sorry, Matt introduced me to that concept, but independent of the severity, I feel like Tinsley disproportionately has the folks with greater burden of social determinant challenges. So I'm just wondering, if that's something that's been studied, if it's worth studying, if there's a way to study it, and how much, because that has such a huge impact, in terms of what happens post-discharge.
Can I make a comment about that? So, I don't know how familiar with who gets put into Tinsley versus hospitalist. If you have a UAB primary care doctor, you go to hospitalist. So if you go to Tinsley, you're either a medicine, a resident, clinic patient, or you're not or you're unattached, or you're MRN.
Yeah.
So,
Go.
No, I speaking to your point of social determinants of who goes to Tinsley. Tinsley absolutely captures people who aren't already tied into, or may not already be tied into a primary care.
I think it's lumping at a system level, lumping Tinsley and hospitalists as generalist service together. I wonder if the experience at UAB is idiosyncratic, or if there is some generalizability to that.
I think that's a really interesting question. It would be really interesting, and I don't know how to tease it out, to look at multiple hospital systems.
Teaching service versus, I would definitely not lump together the hospital service and
Or just some,
because I think they're distinct populations on purpose.
Just going back to your Tinsley service question. So, for example, all the patients from the 1917 clinic, by default, they're going to go to Tinsley, they're hospitalists. Some of them just by MRN, just what Matt said. But, patients also with the Cooper Green, also to Tinsley, typically. Yes.
I was just thinking, and there's so many factors, there's so many institutions, there's so many over this and that, and a person needs to think and take into account so many factors. But just if you forget about all of that, if you just put aside everything and think, you've been in a residency, you've observed a lot, right? You've been on a research side a lot, so you've got all that information yourself. So if you forget it and put aside all other factors and people saying, what would you think would be a solution? Like what direction you think you should be going as a as a clinician, as a researcher, as a, you know, so I think
So
like
you mean
it's
solution
something
for
to do like
me?
my searching. Yeah.
So I think there's two part of it. So solution for me is a professional or solutions to that issue. So I think in terms of the heart failure, you know, prevention of the readmission, so I think there are two kind of groups of patients, you know. One group of patients, they would need hospital admissions because they're too sick. So I don't even think we can target and we can reduce readmissions for them just because this is a solution for them. They have to be in the hospital for, you know, advanced heart failure or something like that. So I'm not even talking on this group. I'm talking more about patients who have maybe index hospitalization, 1 or 2, and just exactly to prevent them from going into the cycle of readmissions. So for them, as I said, you do to focus on them as a whole people, you know, with other issues, not just heart failure, like help them navigate with a pretty severe, you know, significant severe disease with a lot of, you know, life-limiting recommendations that we put on these patients actually on. So that's one of the things. So I'm thinking about other, you know, disease that we have actually positive experience, for example, diabetes. So I think it's a little bit better. It's also, you know, complicated condition, but we do have experience, for example, with the peer support and with the peer coaches that help these people to navigate at home. So maybe similar approaches to heart failure could be a solution. Personally, from my perspective, I'm in the best place of my life, being a clinician and a researcher at both times. So that's what I want to do after I finish.
So I think, you know, thinking about, you know, the population of heart failure, it sounds like you've really got to make a case with your preliminary studies that the people who have the readmissions, that among those, I'm going to say non-LVAD, non-end stage, that the other ones do account for rehospitalizations. I mean, I would assume that their rates of rehospitalizations are lower, but there are so many of them that any little thing, any point you can move the dial, but you need to, in any, whether it's a K or an R or whatever it is, that's going to be important to look at.
Yeah, I mean, because the biggest predictor of a readmission is a readmission, usually.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it's the absolute number is the largest. So.
Yeah, and their reasons for readmission are going to be, I assume, different than the
Readmission after incident. Yeah.